the offset market is rife with fraud. I have no doubt about that. I've heard that from investors, I've heard that from purchasers.
So one of the big issues at COP26 is companies' net zero targets. And in order to sort them out, you need to know what your carbon footprint is. Joining me now is Kentaro Kawamori, who's the CEO of Persephone, and you know quite a lot about that. So what's the kind of gap in the market that you've kind of identified?
Yeah, up until this COP, accounting for your company's carbon, or if you're a financial institution, your financed emissions, was quite a niche practice. The people that did it were really doing it for marketing purposes first and foremost, and now carbon accounting, as we call it, or climate accounting, is becoming a regulated non-financial disclosure.
Right.
And so really what the gap was having an underlying technology platform or accounting system of record like you would have in financial accounting that can collect the data, make the calculations, and then ultimately enable trust and being able to do things like auditing.
So is it a little bit harder than it would, on the face of it, appear to kind of get this data together?
Very difficult. You'll frequently hear people complaining about the complexity of Scope 3, but broadly...
And that's the kind of emissions from your customers rather than just, or in your supply chain, right?
It is, yeah. It's the creation of products, so downstream sort of consumption of raw materials that you then turn into finished products that you then distribute.
Yeah.
The biggest problem around Scope 3 emissions is you then have to go collect third-party data.
Right.
And the minute you don't have that data yourself, the complexity skyrockets.
Right. And so, is it different if you are a bank relative to if you're an energy company? It's a different process. It's not the same process, which complicates things further, right?
Very different. So if you think about an energy company, the energy company's activity is producing energy. And so if it's an oil and gas well, that well is getting drilled.
Yeah.
There's an enormous amount of power that gets used to create that energy. About 10% of global emissions comes from the energy industry to create energy.
Right.
If you're a bank, there's this tiny subcategory in Scope 3, which is called the investment subcategory.
Right.
And that's that concept of financed emissions through lending currency or through making investments.
Right.
And thus enabling and inheriting the emissions as part of the carbon ledger.
Right. And so, Mark Carney's G-Fans initiative last week, you've suddenly got all these banks who are running around trying to figure out what their financed emissions are, the emissions in their loans and bonds and all the rest of it. Is that a big opportunity?
It's huge, and we've been working with 3 of the largest banks up until the G-Fans formation and actually helping them, in many cases, quantify what that looks like for them. For them, it's enormously complex because the large global banks have asset management businesses, they have credit businesses, they have retail and commercial banks. And so their form of financed emissions has more variability than almost any other financial institution in the world.
Right.
It's been very good timing because a number of them, including Morgan Stanley in the US and a small number of the Dutch banks, about 2 years ago, on the back of a Dutch government grant, formed what was called the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials.
Right.
And so PCAF, coming out with their draft financed emission calculations was really the foundation that enabled G-Fans and the actual reality of people being able to make those commitments.
Right, okay. And what do you think about kind of offsets? Basically a big part of net zero commitments are you've got to cut your emissions by, preferably 50% by 2030 and, 100% by 2050. But a lot of companies are not in a position to do that very quickly, so they're using the offset market. Now, how much of a danger is that? Because it can be like a kind of, get out of jail free card, or at least delay.
It is, right? And it's become a hot topic, I think more so than ever. And I think Greta this week was making some comments about.
Yeah, she does. She's not hot on them, is she?
She's not. I don't think it's quite so black and white. I think it's very clear we're going to need high quality, verifiable offsets to attain a net zero future.
Yeah.
I think to be pragmatic, that has to occur. I also do believe the offset market is rife with fraud. I have no doubt about that. I've heard that from investors, I've heard that from purchasers,
which is kind of awkward, right? Because
it's very awkward.
We kind of need these things, and the money from them is useful in kind of financing, stuff to do with forestation and, or any kind of offset. So you kind of need that money, but you also don't want fraud. So what can you do about that?
That's right. I think it comes down to regulation. So, for example, regulation can go both ways. We need regulation that regulates the carbon offset markets and creates cap and trade systems and border tax schemes. But if you look at regulation gone awry, you look at what the EU Commission did.
Yeah.
So 10 years ago, all of these rules making biofuels one of the renewable energies in the US, the southern part of our states are just getting devastated old growth forest and then shipped off to Europe to be burned.
Right.
And so there's ways to game the offset system, which right now have to be solved.
Right. And I mean, on that subject, what do you think of this voluntary carbon task force that Carney, Winters, that people are involved in? I mean, they seem very hot on this idea of trying to solve these issues, but equally a lot of people are worried about, just scaling up this massive fraud-enabling carbon market. So are you a fan, or are you kind of skeptical, or what?
A little bit of both, right? I think to be pragmatic, it has to start. If we wait for involuntary, then we're always subject to the time cycles of legislatures and regulators, which are always going to move slower. The contrary is the voluntary markets will always be less reliable. They'll be less audited. And so there are some really big names and institutions associated with it. They're going to have to make sure that there's very tight audit mechanisms, verification mechanisms for offset projects.
And then there's the other problem is all the guys over there are trying to kind of negotiate Article 6, which is also kind of related to this. And there's a big question about how you mesh Article 6 with the voluntary market. And do you have any confidence that that is very easy to do? It doesn't sound it, does it?
Confidence of being easy, no, but watch the incentives is what I would say, right? I think where the incentive structures lie is where you're going to see the most movement, and where you're also going to see the most perilous instances of fraud.
Right.
And we're seeing that whether it's Article 8 funds being formed, whether it's offset markets, voluntary, involuntary, people are going to rush capital into developing projects that are going to incent them the most from a financial perspective.
Yeah.
We need that, but that also means that's going to create behavior that's not in line with the intended effect.